Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, we hope that you have a great break. And now we will start with our first thematic session, which is about understanding the likelihood of prevalent risks, political dynamics of hazard, and disaster policy making in Southeast Asia. I am honored to introduce our moderator for this session, His Excellency Huang Antoine, ASEAN Deputy Secretary General for ASEAN's Political Security Community, or APSCD. I would like to also introduce the amazing panelists for this session, Dr. Amot Mani Dixit, ADRRN Chairperson, General Secretary of National Society for Earthquake Technology, Nepal, Dr. Philip J. Fermonte, Executive Director of Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, Dr. Naoyuki Yoshino, Dean, Asian Development Bank Institute, and Mr. Hans Gutmann, Executive Director, Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. Please give a big round of applause for the moderator and panelists of our first thematic session. His Excellency Huang Antoine, you may start this session. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. First, I think I have to thank the MC. She has, made my life much easier, so I don't have to make, a lengthy statement to introduce, the distinguished panelists who are on this panel with me today. And welcome to the first thematic section, Understanding the Likelihood of Prevalent Risks, Political Dynamics of Hazard and Disaster Policy Making in Southeast Asia, of the ASEAN High-Level Symposium on Disaster Management 2020. As you have already been aware, Southeast Asia is vulnerable and prone to disasters, particularly in light of extreme weather, and which is brought about by climate change. Initial estimates of the annual losses in the region related to natural disasters are at 4.4 billion US dollars. 4.4 billion US dollars. And every year, the region is impacted by earthquakes, tropical cyclones, floods, droughts that affect millions of Southeast Asian citizens. I think all of us are a bit lucky because we are having this symposium today. If we had the symposium which was held yesterday, perhaps many of us would be late for the event because of the flood. The rain was not so heavy, but the flood was heavy in Jakarta. So Jakarta is only one of many parts in the region that were affected by natural disasters. And in the region, regional tools and mechanisms have been put in place to deal with disasters. At least more than 20 of its kind noted, including ASEAN Strategic Dialogue Partner, a Policy Dialogue on Disaster Management, ASEAN ICRC Platform, ASEAN Joint Disaster Response Plan, among others. However, this seems to be not enough to deal with the natural disasters in the region. We need substantive synchronization and inclusive participation among these platforms. And these need to be strengthened in order to accelerate the attainment of disaster resilient ASEAN community, as emphasized by ASEAN Vision on Disaster Management 2025 and the ASEAN Social Cultural Community Blueprint 2025. The speakers of this panel are informed and they are requested to focus on, among others, three issues. One, to what extent the current disaster policy making structures work in your country or in your region. And we would like the panelists to share with us their practices on the limits, influential factors, and consideration to request or accept international assistance in case of natural disaster. Two, disasters frequently occur during political moments such as elections, conflicts, or peace negotiations, and how further it affects the community, including their livelihood, the voting behaviors compared to during non-political moments. And we would also like the panelists to share with us their reflection on their own experiences, on observations. And lastly, we would like to learn about the innovative practices that were adopted to strengthen political commitments and awareness on disaster management in ASEAN and individual ASEAN member states. So without further ado, I would like now to invite Dr. Disis to speak first. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency, the moderator, Antoine. I'm speaking on behalf of 50 civil society organizations spread in 20 countries and serving millions of beneficiaries in Asia. I'm also representing an institution called the National Society for Earthquake Technology, which I founded several years ago, almost 3 decades ago, and working with the people. I have got, responding to the questions raised, I have 4 points to make. I want to highlight here the persistent gap between policy and implementation at the last mile and the need to enhance our efforts towards that. The second point is the question of internalization of DRR into the day-to-day political agenda of countries, highlighted by the recent events of disasters in many countries. The third point is the need for strengthening regional and bilateral partnership and collaboration, not only among agencies and institutions, but also on an individual level. And perhaps remember the 3 political action points pointed out by the Asia Pacific Disaster Report 2019. I thank the organizers for me to be able to sit with this distinguished panel in ASEAN and in this beautiful country, a dreamland for disaster risk managers like me, in Indonesia, which is one of the leaders in disaster risk management over the last couple of decades. Going to the first point, what we see is that Kobe or Hyogo and Sendai, they triggered the process of policy formulation, which has gathered much momentum at the national level, not so as in the provincial and the local level. The implementation is a challenge, and with the emerging hazards and risk and the growth, what we see that this persistence gap between policy and implementation of action at the last mile, at the local level, it is acquiring new urgency. What we see is that the structures are being built up, but the internalization is a very big problem. And that is, I tell from the perspective of Nepal, which is undergone the federalization, and I see the tremendous gap. People are waiting for benefiting from these new changes in global changes, global mechanism that is encouraging, but they are almost like helpless at the last mile. So that is a problem, and that problem, perhaps, the genesis of that problem, the way we see it, is that the paradigm shift from this, the need for a proactive action still needs to be strengthened into the psyche of our leaders, into the psyche of our managers, because, and there is still much gap of awareness and capacity at the very high level. We have not been able to create demand, and still there is, in case of Nepal and South Asia, I see that the investment is still very low, and the use of science and technology and innovation is not being promoted. In the 8 minutes time, I can speak only this much about the first point. The second point I would like to highlight is that this DRR, or a synthesis of DRR and climate change and the economic agenda, it is still not a part of the day-to-day political activities, political agenda. The emergency response catches very up in the political agenda and in their activities or in their political statement during the elections, but the risk reduction is still to be elevated in terms of its urgency, and that reflects into the reconstruction in Nepal. It was so hard to integrate the concept of building back better or institutionalization of risk reduction in this wonderful opportunity given by the earthquake for reconstruction, but still they are focused on the building reconstruction, but not on the society reconstruction. Integration of livelihood reconstruction or improvement is still to go, and the glorification is on the, it is a success story, especially in terms of the private houses or the health infrastructure being reconstructed, but one has to go beyond that, to go beyond the earthquake impacted area to the rest of the country in terms of building resilience. So glorification through documentation, through institutionalization is still much to be desired, and for a fighter of DRR, I see that although we have achieved much in the last 2 decades, but still there is much to do and much to go more intelligently. The third point is on partnership. We see wonderful work. This morning we heard the Secretary General, also His Excellency the Ambassador, talked about the partnership and the collaboration, but there are some gaps. For example, the rich experience of ASEAN is yet to go to South Asia, and we look forward to some mechanism so that we could have better collaboration in this area. The same thing goes from, say, I come from Nepal, I live in Kathmandu, and China is our border, but still there is much to flow between China and Nepal in terms of the excellence, the technical excellence in disaster risk reduction and integration of the disaster risk reduction and climate risk management into the development process. My first point is that we can talk about the problems a lot because there are emerging problems coming up and the emerging risks are coming up. All the disasters, they are teaching us a lot. But then I go back to the report that was made last year, the Asia Pacific Disaster Report. ISCAP was there, and my organization or my network, the DRR, also was in the process, and it pointed out the 3 main policy action. The one is the risk-informed policies and investment. The second is the promotion of science, technology, and innovation, especially targeting the youth and the young group, and then the enhancement of collaboration and partnership and cooperation on the ground level, at the individual level, at the institutional level. With these 3 or 4 messages, I think that I should stop here and look forward to the discussion that is going to issue after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Disis, for speaking on time, and you have highlighted the 4 issues that we in our region have also been faced with, and I'm sure that during the discussion and also the presentation later on by the panelists here, that will also be shared, be observed, and also we hope to have some inputs and feedback on your own observation. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Phillips Vermonte. He is the Executive Director of the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's an old friend, and Dr. Phillips has got his PhD on political science from Northern Illinois University in the United States, and he has written extensively, which include the increased number of female members of parliament, identifying its origins and obstacles in Indonesia, the Philippines, and Timor-Leste, and he has co-authored the publication on what happened in the early years of democracy in Indonesia's experience. The floor is yours, Philip. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Antoine, and thank you, ASEAN Secretariat, for inviting me to get involved in this prestigious panel. This is a perspective from think tank, and as Ambassador Antoine read out, my CV is more about political science and political research in Indonesia, and my presentation is also about more or less how we relate these disasters management and political dynamics, especially in Indonesia. And I have a few slides to show in my 8 minutes that are allotted by the organizer. The Secretary General earlier, also Ambassador Antoine, highlighted the fact that Southeast Asia is a vulnerable place for disasters. But if we break down the numbers of disasters, at least in 2018, we could see that some of the countries suffer more from others because disasters strike more frequently in these countries. That includes Indonesia. So for all type of disasters, you can see from the numbers, Indonesia, recorded so many disasters in 2018 alone. Then next, Philippines, and then Malaysia. Flood, Indonesia is the highest, 600 times in 2018. And strong wind, cyclone, storm, drought, landslide, earthquake, volcano, and tsunami. In Indonesia, I think is the only country suffered from tsunami in the past 10 years. So from this, if you look at the data as well, the other countries also suffer, and it is very imperative. It goes without saying that no country in Southeast Asia can deal with this type of disasters by themselves. And it's also imperative that ASEAN, for sure, needs to strengthen cooperation to deal with disasters. And secondly, I don't know, it's next slide. Climate change also the previous slides have yet to include climate change, but recently problems of climate change also increase in Southeast Asia, and it complicates member countries' effort to mitigate these disasters. It adds to the pile, add to the plates of countries in Southeast Asia. Please keep in mind as well, when it comes to climate change, Southeast Asian countries being developing countries with the need for development, and most of Southeast Asian countries are relying on extractive industry for their development. When it comes to the question of environmental problem, climate change, and the need for development, these countries are walking a very thin line to balance the need for more sustainable development that take care of environmental problem, and at the same time the needs for development and to find a source of economic growth. And then I think this is something that sometimes countries outside Southeast Asia do not really appreciate, and at the same time, countries in Southeast Asia also could not find the fine balance between the two. And the third thing that I'd like to mention here is that, in my opinion, from think tank perspective, ASEAN has been dealing with disaster management as a less political issues, and sometimes it prevents from ASEAN from acting quickly in dealing with disasters that occurred in one of its member countries. And then, in fact, since 1976, ASEAN has already had a declaration on mutual assistance on natural disasters that was in Manila. And over the years, ASEAN members are more keen to cooperate, and we produce so many documents and cooperation, as you can see from the slide. The problem is that disaster management fall under various institutions within ASEAN, and the need to mainstream and the need to synchronize all these various initiatives within ASEAN is there, because otherwise, ASEAN could not really mobilize and focus on trying to find a solid preparedness when it comes to disasters in one of its member countries. In the ASEAN social cultural community, as we are having this panel right now, disaster management is one of the issues, one of the main issues of this ASEAN social cultural community. But other ASEAN sectoral bodies also deal with ASEAN with disaster management. In the APAC, ASEAN Political Security Community, it's been discussed in ASEAN Defense Ministerial Meeting, ASEAN Regional Forum, and so on and so forth. So this, I think, the third issue, I would like to also highlight what the previous speaker had mentioned, the synchronization and then the cooperation from these different bodies within ASEAN is really needed. Now, can we see disaster as a political related event? And actually from our experience in Indonesia and in some ASEAN countries, there are political issues surrounding this disaster management. Number one, among other things, at least in Indonesia, should we have civilian-led response versus military first responders? In a country that is democratizing like Indonesia, it is one particular issue that we continue to deal with. And also, in a country that is democratizing, decentralizing, which one is more proper? Is it decentralized approach or centralized approach? Both have different positives and negatives. And then thirdly, issues that we've seen in many parts of the regions, including also in Indonesia, regarding the acceptance versus rejections of international assistance. To what extent external or international assistance should be pushed or should be accepted. And lastly, also the role of media sometimes can exacerbate the problem when it comes to dealing with disasters. At the same time, media also is very important for us in dealing with a disaster situation. Now, in the context of Indonesia, this is what happened, because as you see, so many disasters occurred in Indonesia in 2018. But also in Indonesia in 2018, that was known as a political year. We had hundreds of local elections occurring at the same time, and that was the year towards general elections in Indonesia as well. And we observed actually disasters because politicians respond to incentives. And this is also an important part for Indonesia to raise the awareness of disasters preparedness. We've seen, for example, during the election time, the disasters that occurred in Palu in 2018, politicians, various political groups compete in delivering, assistance to the affected region. And then during the normal period now, we've seen more and more political parties and political actors try to be seen as the most prepared in dealing with disasters. For example, during the normal period before the election, The ruling party worked together with our search and rescue, national search and rescue agencies, training its member on how to carry search and rescue mission in 2015. Some Islamic parties as well in the East Java province did the same thing, training for their supporters to raise disaster awareness. And even our local General Election Committee, KPU, also gave special course for voters in disasters areas. So these kind of things are actually opportunities. If sometimes we see only disasters as humanitarian problem, but we do have opportunity in relations to political processes, at least in Indonesia. And the impact we've seen as well in Indonesia, these disasters and political processes. The most famous one, of course, the tsunami in 2004. It paved the way for agreement between the central government and the Free Aceh movement in 2005 after the tsunamis. And now, peace is regained in Aceh, so to speak, and development also now continue in Aceh. In the context of Lombok, the disasters in 2018, the dynamics of politics also affect the response from the central government and the acceptance of local people in Lombok area in 2018. And then the gist of the problem is that then how the people perceive the effectiveness of this politically motivated response to disasters. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to highlight that disasters never took place in an empty space. It's always political, especially in developing country with a less institutionalized processes and probably less preparedness. And if we acknowledge this problem, and then we can also deal with the political problem to have better preparedness in dealing with disasters in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
Thanks, Pak Phamong. In Southeast Asia, perhaps Indonesia is the country that is most vulnerable to natural disasters than any other countries, and experiences from Indonesia as shared by Pak Phamong is extremely helpful for the ASEAN member states, because from one point on another, they can look at how Indonesia is handling, the disaster issues, and then, they can learn the lessons for themselves. For example, Phamong has mentioned the sensitivity complications of the disaster management issues in terms of election and in areas where there were political competition. And that we see, not only raise the awareness of the local, but also of the people in the countries, about the issue, but also the issue of political coordination, how to set aside the differences to work together to manage the issue. And it is not only a political or an opportunity for some domestic actors to influence the policy making process, but that would also be a disaster, not a natural disaster, but man-made disaster if they are not handling the issue quite well. Now, I would like to invite Professor Yoshino. Yoshino-san is currently Dean CEO of the Asian Development Bank Institute, Professor Emeritus of Keio University in Tokyo, Japan, Senior Advisor at the Japan Financial Services Agency's Financial Research Center Institute. He got his PhD from Johns Hopkins University, and it is interesting that his thesis advisor was also an economic advisor to former Prime Minister of UK, Margaret Thatcher. And he also got honorable doctorates by the University of Gothenburg, Sweden, Martin Luther University, of Halle-Wittenberg, Germany, and he has also held various important positions in Japan at the Japan's Ministry of Finance, the board members of the Deposit Insurance Corporations, among others. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a kind introduction. I'm an economist, so I would like to look at the disaster impact from economic standpoint of view. One of the difficulties in many countries, in this table, many of you are related to disaster management, Ministry of Construction, and so on. On the other hand, Ministry of Finance is providing finance to support those disaster management. And Ministry of Finance often say, disaster prevention, it costs too much, and it may not be so needed. So it is very important how to measure the impact of disaster. So my first part, I'm going to show there are two ways to show the disaster impact. Okay, this is a map of a 2000 flood of the river in Nagoya region. You can see this red river. And I looked at the 20 cities along this river in comparison to other regions. There are two ways to collect data. One is GDP or sales of each city or village, or tax revenues of each city or each village, comparison to other region which has not been affected. Then we can measure the difference between the two. Then we can look at the damage of each region. So I would like to choose 3 regions out of 20 cities. First one, we are going to look at bottom curve is the disaster-affected region. Their output sales, GDP goes down, and other regions are not affected, so that is normal. Then I would like to look at actual data. This is a region which is agriculture region. Then you can see after the flood of 2000, the big drop, and then 2001, the GDP has been slightly recovered because government support program came in. Then after that, 30% decline of their sales or GDP. And then it continued very long for agriculture sector. And this one, right-hand side, is a Lehman shock. So compared to Lehman shock, agriculture sector shock of disaster was very large. Next, I would like to look at the previous one. This is a Toyota city in manufacturing. Everybody knows Toyota. The impact of the flood was only 13%. They have developed their own way to recover the region, and the Lehman shock became much, much bigger. So by collecting the data of either sales, GDP, or tax revenues, so we can measure the impact of disaster. And this is a very good, important data to show the Ministry of Finance why we need disaster prevention in order to cover all those costs. And I'm now planning to develop the same method to the Philippines and Indonesia to look at disaster. And if we can accumulate these disaster impact every year, wherever you have accumulated, then you can expect each disaster how much it would have impact on the economy. So I think the data shows agriculture sector, manufacturing sector, service sector, they have a different impact. Next, then how do we prepare for those disasters? I think one is pre-disaster reserve accumulation, left-hand side. Then when the disaster happens, there are lots of spending will be needed. Then exposed reserves will be needed. So I think there are 3 stages. Pre-reserve, before the event happens, then big spending, and then exposed reserves. This is the same method as deposit insurance has been constructed. At the same time, we have to find out sources to increase tax revenues, because disaster is just spending. The Ministry of Finance will oppose. We have to spend so much money. Government debt will be accumulated. then where can you find tax sources to increase the revenue? So I'm going to propose next. This is our book with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, Hand of Green Finance. Climate change is very top phenomena in our society. And it is very important to charge tax to CO2, plastics, and other exhaustion gases. Globally, same tax rate. And those tax revenues can be used for the reserves for disaster, because many of the disaster has been created by environmental change. Please go to next. And SDG Objective 17, climate issues are very important. And then we should set up those tax for the waste of pollutions, and that could become a very important sources for all over the world, and same tax rate could be provided. And theoretically speaking, for climate change, people often talk about green bond, green bank, and so on. However, judging from portfolio analysis, taxing those waste, CO2, plastic, NOx, globally, same tax rate is much better for the portfolio allocation rather than issuing green bond and green finance. So those tax revenues can be used for pre-event reserves and ex-post reserves, and that can support the disaster management. And lastly, disaster management is very much political issue. So I would like to talk about Tohoku, Fukushima nuclear accident and tsunami accident. When it happened, I was at the building of 15th floor of financial service agencies. Then there was an immediate meeting at Prime Minister's office. So President of Financial Service Agencies, Minister of Finance, and Prime Minister, Governor of the Central Bank of Japan, all got together. In disasters, in financial side, what it happened was all the cash of the banks has been thrown away. So in the region, cash has been disappeared. And people do not have their own booklet for the deposits. And thousands of the people has no money. And central bank branch office has no cash. The road has been damaged. How could we bring the cash? Then the central bank brought the cash by ship from Tokyo to Sendai, secretly by ship, and bringing huge amount of cash. Then many depositors, they lost credit card, and also all the booklet. So President of Financial Service Agencies and Central Governors decided, in case of Japan, 2,000 US dollar, which is Japanese yen about 200,000 yen, can be withdrawn from the bank without your booklet, as long as branch officers knows your face well, then everybody can get cash. Then people can start their own daily living. So I think after the disaster, so government and prime ministers get together, and quick action will be needed. Otherwise, that will damage many of the economies. So that's all my presentation.
Thank you for sharing with us, very interesting experience, from Japan. But in Southeast Asia, the situation is a bit different because, the areas that are most vulnerable are the poorest regions, in individual countries and in the region as well. How could we tax people, use money for prevention, of natural disaster? That is, a big issue for us. And on the issue that you see or you have mentioned, about face recognition, by the people, I think that, this can be perhaps with the assistance of China as well, with you AI technologies, to recognize the faces, not by people, but that is, the issue in future. May I now invite Hans Goodman he has spent most of his active career in the region. Is that correct?
Yes.
He is executive director of the Bangkok-based Asian Disaster Preparedness Center. Mr. Hans Goodman recently has served the Intergovernmental Mekong River Commission Secretariat as its chief executive officer and facilitated negotiations among its member countries, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, for reasonable and equitable use of the Mekong River resources. Previously, he has coordinated Wetlands Alliance, composed of 50 local and international agencies in the Mekong region, working to reduce poverty in rural areas. And he has brought with him more than 25 years of experience in the area of integrated water resources management, trans-boundary water management, among others. So we are very lucky to have all the experts to come and to share with you. Thank you. May I now invite Mr. Hans Goodman.
Thank you. Good morning, Excellencies, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen. Why am I sitting up here in front of you? Well, it's because doom, real doom is impending. COVID-2019 is raging around the world, dominating the international news, imminent and global. Oops. But now, seriously, disasters are mortal threats to our lives, way of living and economies. Australia was burning a couple of months back. But are we just going to stand on the sidelines and see the fires to consume our future? Well, in 2019, Asean countries experienced floods, droughts, fires, cyclones, typhoons, heat waves, landslides, earthquakes, tsunamis, storms, etc., etc. You know it better than me. The tsunami in Palau in Indonesia in 2018, the dam break in Laos in 2018, floods and droughts in Thailand last year, and as pointed out by our chair, floods here in the city yesterday. We can go on this. But fake media aside, impacts of disasters are real. And as can be seen in this infographics, it's substantial, affects billions of people. Floods and droughts across countries, which are all wreaking havoc and destroying people's lives, pushing families into poverty, children orphaned, tragedies goes on and on. But we're not talking about minor issues here either. Disasters affect society, people's lives and livelihoods, and it costs billions of dollars and affects billions of people. The good news, though, is that less people are dying. The trends in saving lives goes in the right direction. The not so good news is that every year the economic losses racks up even higher. And the costs are mounting. Although we can see a decrease in loss of life, we don't see that decrease in economic losses, which translates into lost livelihoods and dashed futures. How do we address all of these things? And I'm fortunate to sit up here with an economist on my right, because I think this is exactly what I want to highlight. Not only, as previous speakers pointed out, disasters are affecting us in many different ways. We need to think about how to address the onslaught of perils and disasters. Are we powerless to these impacts? Are we unable to deal with the disasters wreaking havoc in our lives? Well, disasters are not just chance as such or acts of God. Natural hazards are just natural events. It's us, people, who insert ourselves in the path of destruction. We are putting the houses in the way of typhoons. We are building cities where there are earthquakes, etc. Thus, the assertion is that disasters are anthropogenic. We make disasters. That may sound terrible, but it's actually good news, because it means we can reduce, minimize, and mitigate the impacts of disasters. Like climate change and environmental degradation, it is within human capacity to stop and reverse these detrimental impacts. This means that we can decide on how to deal with it. This is the entry point of being able to turn the tables around, to take charge. But it also means we need to look at disasters as anthropogenic or human-made structures, and its impact are directly proportional to our social structures in place, our cities, our societies. And this will also allow us to better manage disasters during critical times. Importantly, if we continue to view disasters as things that are happening or acts of God, we will never take charge. How to work this issue? Well, I think recognizing disasters, although individually may be unique extreme events, taken together over time are part of the norm in the ASEAN countries, and as such needs to be taken into consideration as a factor in the social and economic development. But unlike economic growth, underpinning wealth generation and social spending, it is not a continuous, steady development. In fact, it's made up of several disruptive events, much like parts of politics and national security. We, as disaster professionals, need to be more effective in getting the important messages across to our planners and our finance and private business, people at risk or heads of our government. And I greatly appreciate the presentation before because it gave a clear example on how we should make sure that we have a communication of that nature, being able to put disasters into the context of economic and financial planning. It is up to us to make this difference. If we cannot get the message across, we will not shape the future the way it needs to be shaped to secure prosperity for all, a safe world for our children. But how? Well, like hunger and poverty, one underlying issue of disaster impact is inequality. Recognizing that inequality, which causes increased vulnerability, disaster risk, is a starting point to reduce that risk. This is why inclusiveness is so important, and this is why inclusiveness is so high on the global agenda. We also have many good policies, but operationalize these is often lacking. Turning the good intention into the good deed. This is what risk reduction plans and resilience building is all about. And disasters may coincide with other socially disruptive events or trigger events. Thorough analysis can identify the different hazards and allow to understand the potential for linkages and impacts. And again, the previous speaker gave an excellent example of what happened in Fukushima and some unintended impacts by not having cash available. These are things that can, in part, be foreseen. Spending money is to save lives and save money for the future. We must not forget also that an effective response and preparedness is all part of the overall disaster risk reduction effort. So, regional cooperation like ASEAN, we have here a great opportunity in learning from each other, but it does take effort, and I think importantly it also requires trust. And I would urge us all to spend more time with our finance and planner friends and colleagues, to spend more time on understanding each other's language, to be able to communicate it clearly across the different sectors, and deepening the ASEAN cooperation to ensure that resilience to disasters is part of the building of the ASEAN community. Let's make sure we wake up to this now. Tomorrow, it may be too late. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Hans Goodman, for the, I can say, provocative approach, and that would have to facilitate, the discussion later on. And we also agree that, much of the disasters, are not purely natural, but many of them, are also man-made as well. And in ASEAN, we have acknowledged this issue, and you may remember last year, under Thailand's chairmanship with the team Advancing Partnership for Sustainability, so many positive outcomes have delivered, and we see that much more can be done in order to save the green environment for the future generation. Now the floor is open to comments, questions to our speakers. It is now 11:27, and we will end our section here at 1, as suggested by the MC. And we have about 25 minutes now for the Q&A. So I will pick up about 5 questions for each round for our panelists to respond, and then we will continue to the second round. Yes, please. The gentleman in the middle. Please, when you raise the questions, keep your questions brief and precise, so that we will have more questions from the floor. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. All the panelists were very raised some very interesting points, especially the political aspects of disasters. In most cases, most people don't want government anywhere near them because government brings taxes and rules and regulations. But when a disaster occurs, that's the first thing people ask for, is where's my government? So disasters will always be political in that the government bears a large part of the responsibility to make sure that disaster response and relief assistance is provided promptly and to the people who need it. So I believe that's it's something that we all need to keep in mind, that while the event itself may be unforeseen or may occur, as either an act of nature, an act of God, or as one of the panelists pointed out, sometimes our own failures in development by being in the wrong place. When it does occur, that's when government needs to step up, and that's when they really do need to be responsive to their people. And from my experience and what I've seen is poor governance will be forgiven if you respond well during a disaster, but good governance will not be remembered if you respond poorly during a disaster. So that's the time when people are looking at you, and that's the time when people want their government, to come and be present and help them. So I thank you for raising that point, and it's one we all need to keep in mind. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So, yes, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. I was very impressed with this finding.
Can you speak a bit louder?
Yes, sorry.
Can hear.
Yes, just to continue the comment, I was interested in this finding from Dr. Philip Beaumont of 2019 surveys of your voters, that the voters are more interested in, for example...
We can't hear you. Yeah. So can you change the micro? Do you have anyone to assist us?
Okay, can you hear me now?
I think you can change the micro.
Yes. So I would like to refer to the findings of 2019 survey of voters by Dr. Philippe Beaumont, when you say that voters are more interested in infrastructure or social program rather than disasters issue. And I wonder whether because they are not aware that poor infrastructure also cause disasters, whether they are not aware that social protection programs can also help build disaster resilience. So that actually brings me to questions. We have been doing community disaster awareness focusing on save your life, save your livelihood. Basically, it's a more very much like top-down approach for the communities to deal with disasters. I wish now the time for us to change the disaster awareness to communities being aware and demand for resilient infrastructure, demand for development, risk-informed development programs, for them to really deal with disaster from the root causes rather than responding to it. And ASEAN has been spearheading many new agenda in disaster risk management. I wonder this is an agenda that ASEAN can take on. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this question is addressed to perhaps 3, if not all of us. Next question, please. Well, if not, May I now turn the floor to... Yes, please.
It just happened that this table actually have so many questions. After this, Dr. Adit will also ask questions, I believe. My name is Adelina Kamal, and I'm the Executive Director of AHA Center. Thank you so much for the presentations. Quite invoking thoughts, and good to start the day. My question, yesterday, Undersecretary Ricardo Halat and AHA Center met with the head of BNPB Indonesia, Chief General Doni Monardo, and we talk about better ways in mitigating disasters. Then that green approach is now better than gray approach. And the only things that can resist disaster, that can mitigate disaster better, is through green infrastructure or green approach. My question, okay, if the politics is the one that actually attract the voters the most, how about the green approach, climate change? We have the Greta movement. How disaster managers like ourselves make use of this Greta movement to actually highlight the disaster management agenda, so that the voters will actually increase this disaster resilience agenda highest into the political debate. Thank you.
Well, very interesting questions. And well, if not, while you are thinking of questions for the second round, may I now invite our panelists to respond first while you are thinking, of your questions. May I now invite Dr. Dasset? Dr. Dasset, do you want to respond first?
Yes. I don't think that I can respond that with a wider perspective, but I see that this is a very, very big problem, at least in my country, Nepal, where the political maturity is still, I mean, it depends and it relates to the political maturity that a country is having and the maturity of the political personality there. This is a very big question of rational thinking and almost like insurmountable for me to guide this political process into this direction.
Pak Philip.
Thank you for the very active table over there, for the questions. And I probably link them all together in my response. I started with the last about this green approach and so on. In 2019, CSIS, my center, we conducted opinion survey on environmental and climate change. And the result was not optimistic, because only 1.7% of the respondents, meaning representing the Indonesian populations, aware about the issue of climate change and environmental problems. So there are a lot of things to be done in terms of increasing awareness of this problem that we are facing regarding the environment and climate change. And if the voters or the populations are not aware, then politicians might not have incentives to respond, and as a result, this problem will be down on the list of their priorities. So it requires, I think, a lot of actions for civil society organizations in particular, and also I think for informed citizens, organization, institute, and think tanks like CSIS, or as well ASEAN and AHA Center, to increase the awareness. But our other study also find out that as we need more awareness from the citizens about disasters, it seems that in the context of at least Indonesia and probably Southeast Asian countries, it is the bureaucrats that we need to raise the awareness about disasters, because it will affect their approach to the disasters in planning, development planning, budgeting, and so on, and creating and find ways for financing the disaster preparedness program, and so on. Because in many cases in Indonesia, when disasters strike, many times it's the local government that the first to collapse, because they simply not prepared, and because they are not as well mainstream this awareness of disasters. So while we need to continuously raise people's awareness of disasters, I think now it's also time to increase awareness among the bureaucrats, and we need to find ways because, you know, since they are very early in their career, because at one point they will be the one who decide, who will make laws, who will do the budgeting, who will do the planning, development planning, and so on and so forth. Now, when it comes to, and that relates to the question of the governance and then poor governance, I think better preparedness is a function of good governance. And I think if we could not find, if we could not establish good governance, the results will also impact our effectiveness in preparing ourselves in dealing with disasters. The second question was about the community approach. I agree, it should be the way forward to have community approach. But when it comes to ASEAN, I'm sorry to say this here in ASEAN Secretariat, but ASEAN has been criticized as a top-down organization. And if we want a more community-based approach, then I think ASEAN needs to forcefully also shift the approach of how ASEAN operates, that is, to be more bottom-up kind of regional organizations. And I think we've seen some progress. I mean, some credits for ASEAN as well. In the past few years, ASEAN, through the ASEAN socio-cultural pillars, realized that it's now time for ASEAN to have a more bottom-up approach, unlike in the past. And I think this is also the opportunity that we all need to take into account as well.
Well, before I pass the floor to the third speaker, to respond to that, so the action from ASEAN that Pak Phillips has mentioned, I think it is also provocative as well. So as like the decision which is made by individual ASEAN member states, it is a political decision made by consensus of ASEAN. So you can multiply the sensitivity, the complication from how decision making is made, is deliberated in one country. You can multiply by 10. You can see the complication. The second thing is about the resources, the experience, the coordination, synchronization among several platforms and institutions. So these are a few of the many, these are some of the many issues that we are dealing with, but I can assure you that later on I will be spending a few minutes to speak how the security political pillar, which under my purview is doing over the past few years, so we can have a clearer picture. But mostly now the issue is managed under the ASEAN social cultural pillar. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Very good 3 questions. The first question is about the role of public sector in case of disaster. That is definitely true. Private sector cannot print money. Public sector is the only one they can print money to support those disasters. So, but when that just happened, central government, local government spend lots of money. And transparency and also those how money has been distributed, and those transparency and tracking will be very important to keep the good governance. Second one is community approach is very important, and we experienced after the big disaster of Fukushima, community level of support, mutual support became very important before the government support came in. Large cities has less community-based compared to rural region. So now in many parts of Japan, in large city, they started to have some trust mechanism in their own community. They clean the road together once every month and so on. So I think the creation of community and trust will be very important. Last one is green approach. I think in order to prevent climate change, green power and green energy will be very important. However, solar power, wind power is still very expensive and compared to coal. That's why many people want to use coal and other energies. So it is very important to increase the rate of return for their green energy. And one of the ways is charging tax on CO2, NOx, and so on, and bring those tax revenues globally to green energy, and then increase the rate of return. That would accelerate the shift from traditional energy to green power. So I think approach for green is very important, but we have to think about how to increase the rate of return, and then charging tax internally. Thank you.
Mr. Hans Woodman.
Thank you. I think previous speakers have fully answered most of them, but I felt a little bit obliged to address the last question regarding the green movement, in part because Greta Thunberg is my country compatriot, who is a driver of this movement. I think in response to Adelina's question, I think it's important to realize that the green movement in this context we're talking about is very much oriented to addressing the source of climate change, in reducing emissions and all of these things. Having said that, on the ground, and all of the youth people, particularly young people that are involved, are intricately weaving this into environmental protection, areas of greening the environment, green area in urban cities, etc. So I think there are opportunities of encouraging people who are working on it to make sure that various aspects of disaster risk reduction goes hand in hand. You mentioned green infrastructure as part and parcel of risk reduction issues. So I think being able to perhaps not divide, but start to package in some of the tools and mechanisms in the environmental movement and this greening movement is a way to go. Sorry, that was just my short input. Thank you.
Thank you. Now the floor is open for the second round of Q&A. Yes, please.
I'm Tahini from ECHO. One of the panel members actually mentioned about that the policy and implementation there's a gap between the policy and the implementation. So at the end, the last mile is the people are left to themselves. Nevertheless, we have social protection mechanisms in the governance systems. How is this utilized in order to also address that last mile? How effective is it within the nations, and where is the political buy-in to actually use existing systems to for the benefit of the most vulnerable people as well, which will build their resilience and have a lesser impact in terms of a disaster? Thank you.
Any questions from the floor? Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for the very good and inspirational presentation. I wanted to point to the remarks that was also made by the panelists on equality, on how inequalities between states and within states can be a factor to consider in disaster management, response, and prevention. And I was wondering whether how the panelists see inequalities can be exacerbated by disaster management response and climate change response. For example, taxes on CO2 emissions. Could that lead to more inequality? And then that would in turn lead to worse disaster management. So how does states then manage that, and sort of the international community? Because if there were less inequality, there would maybe also be less disasters and less negative impact from disasters. Maybe a bit too philosophic, but.
Thank you. Any questions? So I think perhaps we have time for the last question. Who want to speak? To raise the last question? Yes, the lady in the back.
Hello, good morning. I'm Jenaline Soriano from the Asean Center for Biodiversity. It's really not a question, but actually I've been hearing about the green approach, the green infrastructure. So probably it would be better to consider including in the policy making the nature-based solutions, because nature can be a cost-effective means or solution in reducing risk from disasters. Actually, nature-based solutions can help communities prepare, cope with, and recover from disasters, including slow onset events like droughts. Forests and other vegetation help stabilize slopes and therefore reduce the risk of landslides. Wetlands can help regulate floods. Coastal vegetation such as mangroves can provide protection from storm surges, strong winds, and cyclones. So probably better information sharing amongst the humanitarian aid sector, the environmental community, and the climate change policymakers, and the fostering of mutually beneficial partnerships and collaborations are key to better recognizing nature as an effective solution for disaster risk reduction. Thank you.
Thank you. So, because we are approaching to the end of this section, so each speaker will have 2 minutes to respond to the questions and also to speak your last words. Yes.
Very quickly regarding this, the last mile and the safety net. What we see is that we are now again, the formal approaches of enhancing the safety net without consideration of the local strength that is available within the society, it is making it difficult. While, in case of Nepal, while in the lack of the social registry of population and people, the distribution of any assistance is difficult, but at the same time, this lack is not recognition of the existing social network that is pushing the marginalized and the marginalized people further down in society. This is in as compared to the haves, even for the earthquake reconstruction, the marginalized one, those belonging to the lower caste, without using the existing social the framework, they are still in the last part of the queue. So whatever is the formal one or the new ideas of enhancing the safety network, that has again to build up on the existing social network that exists in the society. I think I take up this much.
Thank you. Dr. Phillips?
Because there's no question directed to me, I probably just want to reiterate that while we need to increase awareness among the people, I think it's also time for us to really increase the awareness among policymakers and bureaucrats, because this is, I think, where we are lacking off, at least in Indonesia, that affects the way we mitigate disasters and prepare ourselves. Probably one question that I'd like to also respond, maybe is the question about disasters and inequality. I think disasters really affect the inequality rate in many places in Indonesia, at least, because there's no, for example, insurance mechanism in place, and there's a lack of response from the government. People struck by disaster would certainly lose the properties and so on. And then across region in Indonesia, we see this happen. And not to mention that they become internally displaced person for so long, and then they could not return to the areas, and then they develop back the economy. So I agree that this is one aspect that we need to look into as well.
Thank you.
One question about CO2 emission. If it were taxed, then developing countries may suffer. So if tax has been charged on CO2 and other emission gases, then developing country has a pool of revenues from those tax, and that can be distributed to less developing countries. That could be one way to mitigate those negative impact. Secondly, small solar power panel becomes much, much cheaper, and that can be used for the village to generate their own electricity. And hydro motor has also been created, which can be used very small river rather than very big hydro dam. So I think those technological progress also help those developing countries in various communities. So I think it could be possible to transfer from existing energy to green energy. And social protection is definitely needed. However, in order to keep on providing good social protection, revenues, tax revenues will be needed. Then tax evasion in many developing countries has to also be wiped out so that the proper tax can be collected, and those should be used in social protection. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I'll just pick up a little bit on the question regarding whether disasters are exacerbating inequities and inequalities. And I think there is many of us in the room here who are more experts in this area than I am in terms of evidence that disasters increase the inequalities, whether they are gender inequalities or they are poverty related in terms of economic inequalities or other forms of inequality. And I think the critical issue here is often to ensure that a response or a disaster risk reduction engagement has looked into the differences that these inequities are causing. So we are not building in structures that will exacerbate those differences when a disaster strikes. And I think there's already a solid base of evidence or examples on how to do this. It's very important to put it in place and make sure that it's operationalized across the board in development initiatives. I think I leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. I will spend the last few minutes to share with you the information, the cooperation within ASEAN on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief in the defense sectoral body, and also the mechanisms in the political and security pillar for your information. First, during the ASEAN Summit meeting last year under Thailand's chairmanship, ASEAN leaders launched the satellite warehouse in China province under Disaster Emergency Logistics System for ASEAN, DENSA. And under ASEAN Defense Cooperation, the defense cooperation in the area of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief has been progressing significantly, both in ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting, ADMM or ADMM Plus. And the reason why the ADMM and ADMM Plus has been so active, so I think there are a couple of reasons. The first thing is that this issue has impact, political and military impacts, and political and security impacts for our region. And the second thing is that the military, the defense sector, they have resources to quickly respond to the HADR issue in the region. So about the ASEAN defense cooperation, my staff has prepared for me a 15-page briefing notes, all the information about the cooperation under the defense cooperation sector. So it means that lots of cooperation that is going on under this sectoral body. I can highlight a couple of issues. One is ASEAN defense establishment and civil society organizations under ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting. They have cooperation on non-traditional security. Also under the ADMM, there's cooperation on the use of ASEAN military access and capacities in HADR, the ASEAN Logistics Support Framework, the ASEAN Military Ready Group cooperation, ASEAN Center of Military Medicine on HADR, and under ADMM Plus, the cooperation is on ADMM Plus Experts Working Group on HADR, the ADMM Plus Experts Working Group on Military Medicine. And among these cooperation framework, I have notified the two important ones. One among the others, one is the establishment of various mechanisms that have improved cooperation and better coordination between ASEAN defense establishment and CSO, civil society organizations in HADR. And secondly, the regular ADMM plus HADR military medicine exercises. So we've seen many exercises since the first one started in 2013. And under the AMM ASEAN SOM Senior Officials Meeting, I can highlight a few examples. The issuance of ASEAN Foreign Ministers' statement in the event of disasters in recent years. For example, on the bushfire crisis in Indonesia, the letter sent to Australia on 15 January this year, the tsunami in Banten and Lampung provinces in Indonesia, the letter from ASEAN defense ministers to foreign ministers to Indonesia on 25th December 2018, the earthquakes and tsunami in central Sulawesi, Indonesia on the 4th October 2018, among several others. Under ASEAN-China SOM DOC, JWG DOC, that is the Maritime Joint Research and Rescue Exercise among China and ASEAN member states. And ASEAN and China conducted a tabletop exercise and field training exercise, which was aimed to promote military exchanges and strengthen cooperation between ASEAN member states in China in areas of search and rescue and disaster relief as well as the application of the code for unplanned encounters at sea. And the exercises were conducted in 2017 and 2016. And under ASEAN TOM, the ASEAN Network of Regulatory Bodies on Atomic Energy, ASEAN TOM is currently developing a draft ASEAN Protocol for Preparedness and Response to a Nuclear or Radiological Emergency as a follow-up to the recommendations from the ASEAN TOM IAEA Regional Technical Cooperation Project. Recognizing the importance of the AHA Center in facilitating coordination of humanitarian assistance during emergency situations, ASEAN SOM has agreed for ASEAN TOM to engage and collaborate with the AHA Center to develop and implement emergency preparedness and response arrangements in case of nuclear and radiological incidents during their meeting in January this year. And recently, I would like to share with you, the innovative approach initiated by Brunei Darussalam. Brunei Darussalam has recently circulated a non-paper on ASEAN People's Disaster Fund. So this has not been in existence before. The non-paper was circulated during the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting in Nha Trang last month. The non-paper was intended to be a follow-up to establish a fund to be used for disaster relief efforts in ASEAN member states, and the fund would be open, that is in the draft, and that is still under deliberations by ASEAN member states, and that would be open for contributions from the public, private sector, non-governmental organizations, and governments in ASEAN and beyond. And ASEAN member states are now deliberating this paper. So hopefully that will be completed and adopted before the end of this year, and also before Brunei takes its chairmanship next year. So these are some preliminary highlights of the cooperation under the security, political and security pillar, which is under my purview. So we have over the 1 hour and a half, we have listened to the presentations by the 4 distinguished speakers. They share practices, experience, and also responded to the questions from participants on the floor. And I see that the information, the experiences are quite important for us and would be a good for thought for ASEAN's discussions, not only for the discussion at this room, but beyond that. And we do look forward for further discussion events like this that will help us to gather more inputs and also make more recommendations for our leaders and also for the sectoral bodies of ASEAN when they deliberate the issues of disaster management. May I now invite all participants to give a big applause to our 4 distinguished participants. Thank you very much.
Please give a big round of applause once again for the moderator and the panelists of this great opening thematic session. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I have a very good news because it is now time for lunch. We would like to announce that the lunch will be provided at the foyer of Nusantara Hall. Announcements for ACDM focal points. I would like to kindly request you to be on standby at the foyer of Nusantara Hall, and the liaison officers will further escort you to the ESCOM room for a working lunch with the Secretary General of ASEAN. For the remaining guests, please stay and enjoy your lunch. We will start our next session at 1:30 p.m. Thank you.